So what I'm going to do first off is I'll talk you through some of the different techniques that can be used to help overcome anxiety, but we're also going to look at why anxiety shows up in the first place, because it is a completely natural reaction that you should have in certain situations. It's just that for us human beings, what happens sometimes is it's like we haven't completely evolved properly. So we're still experiencing anxiety that would have predated to running away from a lion or a tiger. For some people, they're having that depth and degree of anxiety just in ordinary everyday life. Next important thing to do is I need to assume the slightly more intelligent look by putting on my glasses to make sure that I can actually read what shows up on the screen. It's a perfectly natural, normal emotion to have. It's an important one because there are times when you should be anxious. You need to have these warning signals to let you know that something might be wrong. However, I see someone saying here every damn day, that's not quite the way in which you should be using your feelings of anxiety. They shouldn't be there every single day. If they are, it may mean that there's something in your everyday life that you need to address. Or what commonly happens for people is they have an incident that happens, so something that shows up in life that causes a sense of anxiety. Now here's the thing, with that, the cause, whatever that thing was that triggered the initial anxiety, it may be a true reaction. And what I mean by that is you should have been anxious because it was an anxious time, something terrible happened. That's fine. However, sometimes it's not a true response. It's an out of context response. So the anxiety that shows up it's not equated to what the situation is that's happening. Now, sometimes what happens for people is when they return to a scenario like that again in the future, it brings up all of that anxiety that they had in that initial time in the past, even though the real trigger, the situation that was initially very negative for them, isn't happening anymore. So what we call that in NLP, we call that an anchor. So it's felt like the anchor that you get on a boat, although there's no correlation between the two. So what that means is that you have an internal feeling which is triggered by something that goes on in the outside world. And even though that situation that happened originally isn't happening anymore, if the stimulus appears to be the same, you can react in the same old way. So that same old anxiety comes up. I'll give you an example, thank you. That's David291182 who said, I have wonderful hair, thank you. I made an effort today. So tip number one is make sure that you can kind of retrack where this anxiety started from. It's not always possible to do so, but if you know that the anxiety that is still in your life now was triggered by something once upon a time, you need to deal with the emotions that went with that once upon a time incident. You need to find a way of releasing that and letting it go. That might mean addressing a situation that you haven't addressed yet. It might mean needing to apologize to someone and say sorry about something. It could be anything. But tip number one is make sure you deal with your anxiety in that way. Now, if it isn't tied to a significant emotional event, and it appears to be that the anxiety is coming up just because of habits, and it's just a pattern that you've gotten into, you don't know where it started, but it's still showing up on a regular basis, then there is still some other things that you can do. So I'm going to do a little bit of drawing for you now. Now this is something that I use with children who have anxiety. One of the elements that I work in is helping children using the skills of NLP. So I help them with things like confidence building, overcoming stress, and exam stress is a big one for kids, dealing with bereavement, all sorts of things. This technique works really well for children, but it actually works really well for grown-ups as well. So here's what we do. We're going to do something that we call personification, which is a beautiful word. I could YouTube this myself. Yes, you could, but you're not. I am. Personification is where you it's almost like you build a character around the thing that's causing the anxiety for you. So my one that I use when I'm working with children is I talk about, if I could give a character or a face or a body to my sense of anxiety, then it would look something like this. It would be spiky looking, and it would have a kind of growly, spiky, grumpy looking face. It would look something like that. Now, when I've given it a face and a body, it turns it into a thing. It stops it just being an emotion that shows up. It gives it some physical form. And sometimes it's easier to deal with stuff when they've got physical form, because it doesn't seem as if it's just floating around in the air anymore. Typically, I would then give it a name. So what we do when we give something like anxiety a name, we want to make sure that in a way we start to humiliate the emotion so that it's not so scary for us anymore. So for example, if your anxiety for you feels like it's really feisty and a bit aggressive, don't give it a name that reflects that. You know, you wouldn't call it growly. Thank you. I'm loving my artwork today as well. Yeah, you wouldn't call it a name that gives it a sense of power. You want to give it a name that makes it seem a bit silly and pathetic, because that puts it into a different perspective for you. So starting to change the language around your anxiety can start to make a really big difference. You know, if people talk about their anxiety as giving them fear, there's certain emotions that we can really attach to a sense of fear that make it even more fearful. But if we maybe change the word fear to, you know, fuzzy or wobbly, like wobbly still kind of says the same thing, but it takes away a lot of the scariness of it. So what about if we called this, instead of calling this like anxiety, fear, or anything that really carries high emotion with it, we just called this Mr. Wobbly. Now, as I said, I use this with children. Sometimes when I do this with adults, they're a bit like, come on, I can't think of it like that. But listen, I'll give you a really good example. There was a guy I was working with who had something called Agri Phobia. So he hadn't left the house for a long time. He used to work. He wasn't working anymore because he couldn't physically get himself out of the house to go to work. And the anxiety that he experienced showed up in his language so much. You know, it was on the tip of his tongue all the time, and he'd even made up words to explain his anxiety and convinced himself that some of these words were actually true and correct. Do I do home deliveries? Sometimes, it depends. So we can really get very tied up in our own stories sometimes, such that we start to believe our own BS. And it holds us back. So this guy was saying things like, when I get angsty, ... I would feel like this, I would do this. And I said to him, angsty? Like, that's an interesting word. Like, where does that come from, angsty? And he'd started to sort of develop his own language around it. And I said to him, I want you to stop using that language because it's holding you in a certain place. I want you to start using language that makes this thing look a bit daft and a bit silly now. You're going to feel a bit silly doing it, but feeling a bit silly is actually a lot better than feeling frightened. Feeling a bit silly is an awful lot better than that gut-wrenching sense of anxiety. So if you can start to put this thing into a different kind of category in your mind, then you can start to approach the solution to it in a very different way. So that was what he did. He started to talk about feeling wobbly. Every time he spoke about the anxiety and he tried to use the word anxiety, I'd go, it's not called anxiety anymore, it's called feeling wobbly. And it just started to chip away at the power that this thing had over him, which is really important. So on the note of language, the other thing that's really useful to do is when someone is actually in the anxious state. Do I live near Brighton? No, sorry, Hertfordshire is where we're based. So the other thing that you can do around anxiety when you're in it, because that's the tricky thing, when you're in it, it's not as easy to be logical about all the different ways to get out of it. But what you can do is you can put up a pretty decent fight. So on an example of another client that I worked with, this lady also suffered with anxiety. And she'd got into her head that positive thinking would really help her move forward. Now, a lot of the time when people hear about things like NLP, they do think it's all about positive thinking. The truth is, it's not just about positive thinking. There's actually a great deal more to it than that. It's about useful thinking. It's about really good cognitive thinking. So it doesn't necessarily need to be positive. It's about getting the right result. Now, this lady, she found herself waking up in the middle of the night and having this deep sense of anxiety, and tried to reassure herself by being super positive. So she was saying things to herself like, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, and you can do this, and keep going, and like really lovely reassuring words. But the thing with anxiety is it's like, you know, it really packs a punch. And if you've got something coming at you like this, and you stand there going, everything's going to be okay, it's just not going to cut the mustard, is it? So if you were, you know, if this was an argument that you were having with something that had a physical form that was standing there in front of you, someone suggesting Xanax, well, you know what, there is a place for drugs, but we'll talk about that in a second. So if this was someone standing in front of you who was, you know, going at it, big guns, and really trying to interrupt your emotional state and upset you, you wouldn't just stand there going, oh, it's okay, don't worry, because you know it wouldn't work. So you need to tackle your anxiety in the same way that you would tackle something that's coming at you like this. And that might mean that you hit it back like this, so that there's actually a reasonable debate that goes on between yourself and the anxiety. So if you wake up in the middle of the night in a state of panic and worry, probably the best response isn't going to be, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. It might be something more along the lines of, shut up, I'm trying to sleep, and it's not reasonable for these worries to be in my head right now. Go away. If you've just tuned in, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to anxiety. So sometimes you need to hit back with a bigger force so that you can counteract the power that the anxiety's got. There's no point in being wishy-washy about it, because your anxiety isn't wishy-washy. If your anxiety's got power in it, then you need to go back at it with the same degree of power and more, so that you can overcome it. Don't be afraid to swear at yourself in your head, or to, you know, really give yourself a bit of a ticking off. I struggle sometimes with my motivation to go to the gym. And when I do get there, there's a little sign that's on the machines, and it says, if you feel faint, nauseous, or something else, tired maybe, you should stop exercising and get off the machine. And I'll be on the machine, and the corner of my eye will see that sign, and I'll be going, yeah, I feel all of those things. I need to stop exercising, go home and eat a biscuit. And it doesn't give me the result that I'm looking for. It doesn't give me the result of actually achieving the physical exercise that I need to be there doing. What I've had to do to keep myself there and to commit to my exercise regime is I've now got like a sergeant major in my head who says, shut the up and get on and do some exercise. Stop whinging. You're going to do this. You're going to do it well. So it's like it's a positively motivating voice, but it's tough. And it's really tough on me sometimes. And it says, go for it. You know, you can do this. Keep going. Instead of the whole, you're all right, you can do this. Because that doesn't work. It's not powerful enough. The powerful thing that's trying to get me off the machine is saying worse things. So I need to be tougher to counteract that in my mind. That's why I've got like the little sergeant major voice that helps me to stay there in the gym. So it's a similar thing if you're dealing with anxiety. If your anxiety is fearsome and ferocious, then you need to counteract it by speaking to that part of yourself with the same sense of power and authority in order to get rid of it. So those are my 3 top tips on overcoming anxiety. Number 1 is establish, are there any significant emotional events from the past that you have not resolved? Is there some unfinished business that you should go and finish? Because if you do, that might just clear it. Number 2, personify it, but make it ridiculous. Take away its power. And number 3 is start talking to it in a different way. We're not going to keep on with this, oh, I'm going to be fine, calm down. It's, you're going to be fine, calm down, get a grip, get tough with yourself, and you'll get tough with the anxiety too.